Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Flawed Theology Podcast. I'm Phil.
And I'm Susie, and we're asking the question, if your theology were wrong, wouldn't you want to know?
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode. We're going to call this episode the one with the real God. We're going to put real in quotes. Now, we're going to kind of talk about the ways that you would expect a God to reveal himself, like ways that you could prove that a God was real if God did it, and then what it would look like if humans created God. And this is loosely or not so loosely based on a blog post that Susie wrote, about a year or so ago?
Yeah.
Called If God Were Real.
And I think it's not necessarily about proving that the God is real, but just what would you expect reality to look like if that God were real? And what would you expect reality to look like if the God of religion is based on is not real? And what do we see in our reality?
I think it's going to be kind of an interesting conversation. And one thing we're going to add to it is, what could God do better? Which I think is a really fun kind of epistemological question. Like if you're talking to someone that is a believer about the existence of God and all that stuff, you could be like, okay, well, let's take your God and let's say, well, in this situation, what could God do better? And use that kind of as a thinking point for them to be like, if you can think of a way that you could do it better than God, well, then
what does that say about your God?
What does that say about your God? So,
well, I think a lot of Christians would say that, oh, but this is you thinking you're smarter than God, or, you're just human and you're finite. You can't totally understand his ways at all.
Yeah.
But like you said, if I, as a finite human, can think of one small way that God could do better, that should say a lot about the Christian God.
Before we get into that, we'll just kind of catch up on things since the last episode. And have you been reading any good books lately?
I did just finish one. It has nothing to do with religion.
Okay.
It was a John Grisham novel that my mom gave me.
Oh, nice. Okay, yeah. John Grisham lives like not too far from me, actually, down the highway. Yeah, like
I would go berate him about some of the things he's written about.
Yeah, I like his writing, but I knew a friend that actually did alarm systems. They're like, oh yeah, we're going to do John Grisham's house. And I'm like, wait, he lives around here? Yes, but yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah, I've been reading a book called Goodbye Jesus by Tim Sledge, who was a pretty big Southern Baptist pastor out in Texas. But he goes into like an insane amount of detail about what it's like to be a pastor and all the kind of political stuff that goes on in churches and stuff. So I would highly recommend that book if you're someone that came from the Baptist tradition for sure, or if you are not familiar with the Baptist tradition at all, it'd be really enlightening. And then his deconversion story is pretty interesting too. So
yeah, I'm fascinated by pastors who deconvert. They dedicated their life to it.
Yeah.
And then they decided it wasn't real and they walked away. I'm
fascinated by those stories too, because like you could not use the argument against a pastor saying it was never real for you.
You were never a real Christian.
This guy especially, like he basically, from the time of being 16 felt that he was called to be a pastor. And that's what he did for 40 years of his life until it kind of all came unraveled. So highly recommend that book, Goodbye Jesus, by Tim Sledge. Let's get to our flawed theology in real life segment. I have a friend, and she's a pretty amazing woman. She's from kind of like my previous life. She was friends with my ex-wife, but she recently found out that she has breast cancer, and she has been posting. She writes a blog about her journey. She's also in seminary to become a pastor. But anyway, she's been posting all about her journey, her hair loss and, a lot of posts about how God is helping her through this. But she recently posted something that just really kind of irked me. So she posted that she had gotten a fever and she was in the ER, which apparently is not good when you're on chemo to get a fever. She basically says she's in the hospital. She's got a fever. She's on antibiotics. And the church had a number of chaplains available when she got home to come by and see her, that she goes. And she got to see one of her favorite chaplains came by to see her when she got home. And then this is the part that got me. She goes, after telling all about her fever and her chemo and knowing the battle that she's going through, she got to see one of her favorite chaplains. And then she goes, isn't the Lord kind? And that just really smacked me in the face. The picture that goes along with it is her in the hospital bed, with her, her cap on because she has no hair. She's got her mask on. She's under a blanket. You can tell she's smiling and stuff. But I'm like, isn't the Lord kind is not the first thing that would come to mind if that was my situation. So why is this a flawed theology?
Well, I think this is an example of the providence of God, like what we talked about in the other episode. if God's watching her right now, she's suffering. Our listeners can't see this picture, but I mean, she looks really weak.
Yeah.
And God's up there going, the best I can do for you is to send you your favorite chaplain. That's all. I mean, I'm not going to do anything else for you. Sorry.
Yeah, like it seems like if God was kind, like maybe you wouldn't have given one of your children cancer.
Yeah.
And then if you are going to give her cancer, maybe you would heal her from it, or maybe you would not let her have complications that would inhibit the doctors doing what they need to do to help get rid of the cancer, because the chemo apparently is working and doing what it's supposed to do.
And the fact is that she's suffering.
Right.
And he has the capability of ending the suffering. And if anybody should have their suffering ended, it's her. You know, if God is real and she is a dedicated servant of God, why does she have cancer but I don't?
Right.
That's the question that always goes through my mind. Like, I've never had a tragedy like this happen to me or anyone in my family.
Yeah.
And I'm an atheist.
Right. Yeah. You would think like if what they say is true about following God, then you would think that anyone that doesn't follow God is going to be just reaping copious amounts of judgment and horrible things. But you don't see that. I mean, you see horrible things happening across the spectrum of people, whether they're God followed or not.
Yeah, it's equal probability.
Yeah, it's
across
probability.
All types of people.
So like with these segments, we always try to say like, well, how could we think about this better? Like let's put one of us in this situation where we have cancer and chemotherapy and a fever. I feel like if I was in this situation, for one, I would probably be devastated, but then I would also be like highly reliant on the medical expertise of my care providers, you know, my doctors, my nurses, you know, everybody that deal with. That's the people that I would say, aren't these people kind? Like, even though it's their job.
Yeah. Give the credit where it's due. The actual people who are on the floor taking care of her.
Yeah. It's just frustrating to see stuff. And I see stuff like this all the time. It's like people going through horrific stuff, and then they pick out the tiniest little thing.
Yeah.
Then they give God credit for that tiny little positive thing, which, I mean, it's great to see positives in difficult situations. I don't have a problem with that. And I would hope that I would be able to do the same thing in a hard situation.
But like, it's what you're attributing it to.
Right.
Do you know what this reminds me of? The phlebotomist who I tried to compliment, who said, no, it's not me, it's God who's good at drawing blood. And I told you this. She has lung cancer now. She's dying of lung cancer.
Right. Which is crazy because that was like a month ago that you were in like the office and she appeared perfectly healthy to you, right?
I mean, she's older and
I
could see looking back that maybe she wasn't 100%.
Right.
Never in my wildest dreams did I think that she was dying of lung cancer, but apparently she was.
Yeah, and that's crazy. This was a person that gave God the credit for her phlebotomy skills, and then God rewarded her with lung cancer. And apparently not just early onset lung cancer that's treatable. She can't go to work now, right? And she's like literally dying. Like, yeah,
she is. But you know what? She's probably seeing it as that God is rewarding her by calling her home.
Right.
Which you can't argue with.
No,
you can't tell her no. I mean,
no, you can't.
We see it as God is torturing her with an earthly illness, and she will see it as she's getting called home.
Yeah, that's hard stuff. Yeah, well, that's our flawed theology in real life segment. Hopefully it's we're kind of pointing it out, so hopefully, you know, you guys as listeners will see these things and be able to think critically about these situations, and it's useful for you. So yeah, let's get into today's topic, which is the one with the real God. So the discussion about is God real is a pretty popular topic amongst not just religious people, but philosophers and, you know, thinkers in general. It's funny to me because it seems like the only people who don't actually want proof or evidence of God's existence are the ones who categorically the ones who believe in him wholeheartedly.
Right.
A person that doesn't want proof or doesn't want to find evidence, we can't help those people. So that's not what this discussion is geared towards.
But it might get people like that to think. It might get theists to think about, I've never imagined what reality could look like if there were a God who used his omniscience and omnibenevolence and all of that to its full potential. What could a universe look like? And how does that compare to our universe? I think that could get people to start thinking at the very least.
Yeah, I think that's what we would hope would come out of this episode. For anyone who's listening, I mean, I don't know, like the spectrum of people who listen to this podcast, if they're all deconverted people, but if you're a Christian and you're listening to this podcast, I hope that it will challenge your thinking and maybe push you beyond the faith realm into the world of proof and evidence. So for this discussion, we're going to make a few assumptions about God.
Yeah, so the assumptions we're making is that the God in question is omnipotent, omnipresent, loving, merciful, and omniscient. And I think that those are qualities that all Christians would agree that their God has, right?
Right.
Yeah. And that this God in question designed and created the entire universe, including us, and that we as humans have the same qualities that are referred to in the Bible. So those would be like we have a sinful nature, we're broken, we're in need of a savior and salvation. And for the sake of continuity and discussion, we will refer to God as a he, even though there's no reason God has to be he. It's hard to remember to say it all the time.
Yeah, because it's really funny to me when people talk about, they always say, oh, well, God is genderless, but then the whole Bible says that he's a he. And then all the structures of everything are also patriarchal.
Yes.
I found it actually really like liberating when I was like deconstructing the idea of, oh, well, maybe God is a woman. And then that kind of changed my view of God a little bit.
I mean, wouldn't it make more sense? Like that women are the ones who give birth to new life. So wouldn't it make sense that a God would be female?
Yeah. The idea of God as mother made a lot more sense in that context. Of course, now it doesn't make any sense at all. But at the time I was like, okay, well, the patriarchal thing needs to go away. So God as mother makes sense.
Yep.
So what we decided to do is we're kind of just going to discuss a few categories that we can compare how a real God would be versus a fictional / human created God. So the categories would be like, how would this God reveal itself? How would this God interact with humans or his creation? How would this God communicate with the world? And what would this God be like? Like, what would his character be? And then, like we said earlier, we're going to talk about those categories, discuss about how God could do it better based on kind of how we see the current expression of God. And I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier about like people thinking that they're smarter than God.
Yeah.
But like that's such a cop out. It's like one of those cop out things. It's like one of those thought terminating cliches like, oh, you're not allowed to question God because God is bigger than us. Well, that's a perfect thing that you would say if you made up your God.
Yes. And you can't tell me I'm not smarter than God if I can objectively find a better way to do something than God.
Right.
Then the Christian God isn't mysterious. He's basic.
All right. So let's get into our first point. How and to whom would God reveal himself to humanity? So let's talk about the who first.
All right. If a God were invented by humans, then we would expect that God would favor the group that invented it, right?
Yeah, that would make sense.
And that's exactly what we see with Yahweh. So Yahweh apparently has access, unfettered access to all of time, view of and understanding of all creatures. But he chose to contact only one tiny people group, the Israelites. And all of that contact and interventions like miracles and such took place in one tiny strip of land in one tiny sliver of time.
Right.
If you think about eternity, in the billions of years that the universe has been around and 4.5 that the earth has been around, that's a very small window of time that God chose to blip in here and then GTFO.
Yeah. and it's very interesting, like why would he choose the Israelites of all, like why?
Because they created him. Yeah, that's a good question. Why choose the Israelites?
Yeah.
Like it didn't work out, right?
No.
They weren't the right choice. They didn't totally obey God. So why did he choose them if he's omniscient? Yeah.
And if God were real, who would he reveal himself to? He would reveal himself to everybody. It wouldn't be like a select group of people. It would be all of humanity would be like, here's God. And he'd be like, hey, I'm your God. And it would be really clear and obvious. It seems to me like it wouldn't be this small group of people, there wouldn't be like the elect, which you hear in Calvinism about there's, select people that have been predestined by God to be chosen. Like that's not how a God would do things if they really wanted to make their presence known.
Yeah, and Christians would say that God eventually did expand his view to all of humanity, and wants more of a global interaction with us. But
Right.
in the Old Testament, Yahweh was racist,
Yeah.
was selective with ethnic groups. And according to Christians, God never changes.
Right.
That speaks for itself.
Yeah. And even when you move forward into the New Testament, like for the first bunches of the New Testament in the early church, they were only ministering to Jewish people, you know, and then God had to come and step in and say, oh, no, like the Gentiles are okay too. I'm their God too.
Paul said that.
Yeah. Peter and Paul, you know, like they came, you know, Peter had that dream about the unclean foods. And that was, you know, supposed to be God telling him, no, the gospel is for the Gentiles too. And people were like up in arms about it. They were like, oh, no, we're not, you know, God's not for the Gentiles. So how would this God reveal himself if God did it, not if a human did it?
There are a lot of ways I think that a real God could reveal himself. But I think that the one way that a real God would not use is the kind of way that he's using right now.
Right.
A sacred text.
Right.
So first, his message was oral. And if we're lucky, these things got written down decades or at most thousands of years after the events supposedly happened.
Yeah.
And then after that, these texts were copied, translated by people. Errors were made.
Right.
Things were tampered with. Things were added and removed. And we talked about this in another episode.
Yeah.
Why would an omniscient God choose to do it this way? I don't think that he would.
Yeah. Well, I would think that if a God really wanted to reveal himself to people, he would use direct revelation. And I think we already kind of said this, like it wouldn't be through the Bible or a sacred text or prophets or, you know, all the ways that you see in the Old Testament or the New Testament. He would just come right down and say, I'm God. Like, you know, it would be very obvious.
But how?
Like,
how would that happen? Like in corporeal form?
Sure. If the Bible is not the best way to reveal yourself as a deity, which we clearly don't think it is because of all the typographical errors and the historical errors and the scientific errors, which, you know, we covered in previous episodes. And let's not forget that the Bible isn't everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So if you are a God, wouldn't you want to be revealed everywhere?
So if a God did want to do the sacred text thing, then why couldn't God have like zapped, just like the 10 Commandments, right? Into the stones, like zapped exactly what we need to know down in some form that's preserved into each civilization, even if it happened thousands of years ago when civilizations were isolated, then don't you think that would be really impressive if archaeologists uncovered these stone tablets that say the exact same thing in every language and none of these civilizations had access to each other?
Right.
That would be crazy. And
like across different like time periods too. So here's something from 10,000 years ago. And we just found this other thing that's 150,000 miles away and it says the same exact thing and it's in a different language. You know, there wouldn't be any confusion that way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing that police use in like evidence collection, forensics, like corroborating evidence. Like you're looking for things that line up.
Yeah.
So yeah, if he was to do a sacred text, he could do it that way. Or he could just like put it into everyone's consciousness, right?
Yeah, sort of like a download.
Yeah, just
yeah.
I think the thing about this would be that everyone would have the same information. Because I think Christians and stuff would say, well, God already does this. I have this connection with God, but everyone's connection is different.
Yeah.
The Baptist connection to God is totally different than the Lutheran connection to God. And it's certainly different than the Muslim connection to God.
And then people like us who say that we don't hear anything from God or we haven't received any direct messages from God.
Right.
They say we just aren't listening or we're not open to it or whatever. So that wouldn't be possible. Like if God was real and he wanted me to know something, I would know it.
Yeah.
Regardless of if I wanted to know it or not.
Yeah.
And this knowledge would come in a way that it was obvious it was external to our own consciousness because, you know, thoughts can pop into your head.
Yeah. This is kind of like a fantastical kind of thing, but like if
it wouldn't be fantastical if it were real.
Right. If it were real, it wouldn't be fantastical. You wouldn't have to like wrap your head around, oh, well, that would never work because blah, 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 because everyone would know it. Like, you know, he could come down in physical form and just visit everybody in the earth like once a year. Like also, if he's omnipresent, that would be no big deal. He could just pop down and be in everyone's living room all at the same time. Like,
yeah, sort of like that. What was the episode? The Divine Hiddenness episode. The beginning was like, like a floating pillar or something. Yeah.
And then the cool thing about that would be Jesus would be in your living room and you would like call me and be like, dude, Jesus is in my living room. And I'd be like, yeah, he's in my living room too. And you'd be like, holy shit. You know, we call a bunch of people and they'd all have Jesus in their living room. And then you wouldn't be able to argue with that because here's hundreds and thousands of people that all have Jesus in their living room.
Yeah. And Jesus could answer questions. We could ask him questions. He could answer questions about life, the universe, and everything, and basically not be a mysterious a-hole who refuses to talk to us.
Yeah.
There was a Holy Kool-Aid video where he suggested holy billboards like that randomly pop up, and they're tamper-proof, so nobody can like vandalize them or anything, and they're divinely protected. And he had these pictures of them, and they said really funny things like during the bubonic plague, it was like, it's the rats.
Oh, and like told them information that only God would know.
Yeah, like really helpful information. Like wash your hands.
Not like the billboards that you see when you're driving that I just saw last week while I was driving to South Carolina that say, you will meet God.
Okay.
All right. Will I though? Like,
will I?
Met him. Wasn't that great. Thanks very much. But so there's a lot better ways. And we just named, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 of them, a lot better ways that God could have revealed himself, but instead he chose to do it allegedly, the way the Christians say it, through the Bible.
Which is the way that every other religion that they would say is false is doing it.
Right, exactly. Every religion has their own sacred text. The way we got the Bible is the most convoluted way ever.
Yeah.
The Mormons have like their golden tablets with Joseph Smith, and then, you know, the Muslims have the Quran and it came through the Prophet Muhammad and all that, you know, so everyone's got their own origin story and they're all really similar. And
they all have the common theme of having to be translated, transcribed, and propagated by humans.
Right.
The God never does anything. And if the God were real, one would assume, at least I do, that God would take more of an active role in the propagation of the most important message of the whole universe that there could ever be.
Yeah, I think it's funny to me. Like, I think when you think about like mythology, like Greek mythology stories, it seems like those gods were doing it like how real gods would do it.
Oh, yeah.
Zeus came down off Mount Olympus and he was going to kick some ass. And people were like, oh shit, Zeus is mad. Or, oh shit, Poseidon's mad because the ocean is going apeshit, you know, or whatever, you know, like those gods came down and they were pretty clear about what they were there to do. It wasn't like, hey, we're going to send you a book and you guys can interpret it, you know, like.
And you know what else I just thought of? That you would also expect that if this God in the sacred text intervenes and interacts with people and that God's not real, you would expect that that kind of intervention would stop after the sacred text, right? So like in our current reality, you would expect there would be none of that if the sacred text was made up. And that's what we see. Yeah. God doesn't part Red Seas anymore. God doesn't do miracles.
Right.
Even though people say he does, it's easily debunked.
Right. I think if I would have been alive at the time of Moses and saw the Red Sea part, then I would have been like, oh shit.
That's real.
That's real.
Yeah. That guy has a God behind him. Yeah. And, you know, Christians would say, well, God doesn't do this kind of stuff. He doesn't interact with us directly anymore because it would violate our free will. But that doesn't explain why he did it in Bible times.
Right.
And also that it just doesn't hold up in general.
Yeah. Did they not have free will back then?
Yeah. You know? Because, when Moses parted the Red Sea, that took away everyone's free will. They had to believe in God. And for some reason, that's really bad.
Yeah.
So there's another thought I had that if there is a God, it might just not contact us at all. Because what's the point, right? We don't actually have to know that there's a God out there unless that knowledge or belief is part of some kind of divine plan that this God has, that it's going to like cook us for all eternity unless we believe in it.
Right.
Can you think of another reason why we would have to know that there's a God just outside of curiosity and not burning for all eternity?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the only reason to know a God is because he's going to do something for you that is going to make your life better, or is going to make your eternity better, or he's going to give you an afterlife. Yeah, if it's completely possible that God is real and he just is out there and who cares?
Right.
But then if that's the case, it's just like Bart Campola was saying, like about his Justin Bieber $1 million check. You know, okay, well, maybe that $1 million check is out there, but I don't make one single decision based on that money. Yeah. You know, so if there is a God out there and he's not interacting with us, which clearly he's not, then I don't need to make any decisions based on the existence or the reality of that God. All right, so let's go to our second point, which would be, if there were a real God, how would we expect relationships to look in the physical world? What's the first one we want to talk about?
So the first thing is gender equality. If the God were an invention of a group of people that had a patriarchal structure, then you would expect that their God would adopt their patriarchal views. And that's what we see in the Bible. So the Bible clearly paints women as property of men, that they should be subservient to men, that they are the weaker vessel. They should not speak in church. They should keep their heads covered. They need to sleep in a tent when they're menstruating.
Yeah.
They're unclean for twice as long when they have a daughter instead of a son.
Yeah.
Clearly, the Christian God views women as subservient and lesser to men.
Some people might say, oh, well, that's the Old Testament God. But no, it's all through the New Testament. And it's super pervasive today.
Yes.
In the Christian church, like women are not equal in some very progressive churches that have female pastors and, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But there's people that buck against that in Christendom that like, oh, female pastors are wrong. That's not in the Bible. And like,
my mom,
that can't be. And look at like purity culture is a perfect example of patriarchal system that is set up to basically put the burden on women and put the whole thrust of maintaining morality on women, and men don't have any responsibility like in that thing. It's got to be the women's dress, and you got to make your pledge, and you're a crumpled dollar bill if you had sex before you were married. That's yeah.
As we grow as a society and become more enlightened, we know there's no objective or rational reason why people would have different roles based on their gender or their sex.
Right.
So why wouldn't a God know that?
Right.
Isn't it more likely that a misogynistic culture created a misogynistic God than the actual triomni God of the universe is misogynistic?
Right. Yeah.
When you put it like that, it's so obvious.
Yeah. It's just like saying the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree.
Yeah.
If you made up a God, you're going to make him kind of in your own image. And I forget who said this, but I feel like it's Anne Lamott or something who said something like, where a lot of people think that we're made in the image of God, but really what they're trying to do is make God in their own image. And then I think the quote goes on to say, like, if your God hates the same people you do, you've made God in your image. He has not made you in his image.
Yeah.
That's what people do. They look at the world through their own lens, and then they basically bend God to their own kind of worldview. And that's why you have 40,000 different denominations in Christianity, and you have thousands of other religions, because everyone is looking through their own lens and they're trying to make a deity that works for them.
Another example of this is that passage in Leviticus where God says who can and cannot approach the altar. And he lists like all these disfigurements and ailments and diseases where we know that they're not like harmful, like a hunchback.
Right.
Okay. So they had superstitions against a hunchback, different birth defects, blindness, but they were superstitious about it. And so was God.
Right.
But we know there's no reason. There's no legitimate rational reason why those people would be less worthy of approaching a holy altar.
Right.
And the same goes for racial equality, sexual orientation, and identity. I mean, piggybacking on the gender thing, you can replace gender with race, sexual orientation, and it still stands.
Yeah, it's the same idea.
Yeah.
If you're viewing Jesus as white Republican Jesus, you've made God in your own image. A real God would understand that no group of people should be dominant over another group of people or be inherently superior to another.
Yeah, based on their skin color or what latitude they come from. That's ridiculous.
This is what the Holocaust was about. And like the rise of the Third Reich was like, and he used the Bible as the justification. If you've read Hitler's writings, there's scripture all through there. He used the Bible to justify why the Aryan race was chosen by God, and you see the same thing with sexual orientation and all of that stuff, because it's just a way to usurp or elicit power and control over people. It's not what a God, an omnibenevolent and omniscient and omnipotent God, would not do it that way, because he wouldn't need to. Like a real God wouldn't need to control people based on the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or their gender. He wouldn't need to, because he's God, Right.
And the thing about all these things that we're talking about is you can't help what race you are. You're born with it.
Right.
You can't help that you're a woman. You're born like that. And we now know scientifically and anecdotally that homosexuality, not chosen. April Joy talked about this with her brother, that when her brother came out to her, she knew immediately that it wasn't a choice.
Right.
Wouldn't a God of the universe understand that too?
Seems like he would.
You would think.
And the only way he wouldn't is if a man made him up.
Yep. And then one more telltale thing that I want to talk about. Huge red flag that a God would permit, endorse, and write laws permitting slavery.
Right.
Or regulating slavery.
Yeah.
I think that's crazy that people think that could have come from a God. And, there's articles written to justify it and saying, oh, it wasn't that kind of slavery. Well, yes, it was.
Right.
It was. But also that the thing that we hear most is that like, oh, it's a progressive revelation. So God had to meet them where they were. They couldn't understand.
Right.
But really, like, he told them not to eat shellfish. He told women to go sit in a tent.
Right.
He couldn't tell people not to own other people.
Right.
And besides, the New Testament wasn't any better. It still endorsed slavery.
Right.
And at what point exactly did God say, oh, slavery's bad? That's something that humans had to come to on their own.
Right.
Slavery, incredibly damning in the Bible.
Yeah. I was just reading in the book that I'm reading, the Goodbye Jesus book by Tim Sledge. He talks about slavery too, and how initially when he was in seminary or whatever, his professors were telling him, well, God doesn't change, so when God talked about slavery, it was because that's what was culturally acceptable at the time. But then as man progressed, they realized that slavery was bad. So man realized that slavery was bad, but God still said that it was okay. And so they were just adjusting to the culture. And that's why God never came out and said anything about slavery in the Bible, because it was man basically that decided that slavery was bad. And he was basically saying, I couldn't get on board with the idea that my professors said that God never changed when clearly he did. From the Old Testament to the New Testament. Like, yeah,
that's messed up.
There's no way that you could logically defend slavery as a Christian in 2023. Like, you can't.
And God would have known that. A forward-thinking God would have seen this problem coming.
Right.
That, maybe I should take more of a stand against slavery in the Bible, so that in a few thousand years, when they've really figured out that slavery is bad, they won't look back at the Bible and think God really was okay with slavery. Let's not worship this God. Let's not follow this God.
Right.
Especially since the Bible isn't changing. Like, he's not zapping down updates.
Right. There's no updates. Yeah.
There's no updates.
So how about another part of this is like church and doctrine. Like, if God were real, then his church would be unified. You wouldn't have such segmentation and all these different denominations and all these different religions. There'd be one church and one doctrine, and everyone would agree on it because it'd be clear and obvious that it was true. It wouldn't be open to interpretation.
I even think there wouldn't be much of a doctrine.
Yeah.
A doctrine is for control.
Right.
It's like, you have to do this. God is like this. Do this, do that.
Right.
I'm not sure that a real God, would impose so much dogma onto people.
Yeah.
I think it would be like, love people, right? Love people, treat each other with kindness, reduce suffering on this earth, and then everybody will have a perfect life in the afterlife or something. Right.
Yeah. Doctrine is definitely something that is man-made as a way to basically say, because I've got this connection to God, I can tell you what to do. Like, that's what doctrine is.
Yeah, yeah.
If man invented God, you would see what we see now. The church is fragmented due to differences and contradictions in the text, and different humans would create different salvation stories with a crazy convoluted storyline. And the Bible wouldn't make any sense, which it doesn't. And there'd be no evidence for God, which there isn't. That's what it would look like if man invented God. If God were real, how would this God communicate with the world?
So this is communication that's beyond the revelation that we talked about earlier, right? This is like one-on-one communication.
Yeah, this would be, I guess, part of the human divine relationship. Like, how would that work? And I guess this would assume that the God wanted to have relationship with humans. That might be another assumption that we're putting on this God. Like, this God wants to interact with humanity. He cares about us. He loves us. He wants us to be happy, yada, yada.
Which I wouldn't necessarily take that as a,
Right. But since we're following the model of the Christian God, then that's what we would say. Right. So let's start with prayer. Like, would you even need to have prayer if God were real? We kind of talked about this in the prayer episode.
I don't think so, because a God that's omniscient would already know what we want and what we need, and would give us what we need, and would know what's good for us, and so would reduce our suffering already, and we wouldn't need to ask.
Right.
That's why I think that we wouldn't actually have to pray. I think prayer might be more for, like you said, communication and having a relationship. And it would be like talking to this God on the phone.
Yeah.
And this God would actually answer you clearly, like as if I'm talking to you right now.
Yeah. You just pick up the phone, you call 1-800 Jesus talk, and he would answer. And he'd be like, yo, what? That's too many numbers, but
it is too many numbers.
It can be truncated. Maybe in this alternate reality, phone numbers have like 12 numbers, so we'll make it work.
It could be sus talk.
It would be just a conversation, and you could be like, hey, I need this, or whatever. He's like, oh yeah, I already had that worked out for you.
Or it could be like if you're lonely or you're sad.
Right.
Pick up the phone and call God, and he would be like the best therapist.
Right.
Because he made you.
Yeah, and you would get an actual answer that wasn't just like based on your own cognition and your own cognitive biases and your own, like what you wanted God to say.
And he wouldn't give thought-terminating cliches ever.
Right. Yeah, he would actually answer you. And there wouldn't be suffering, and you wouldn't need to pray for like relief for things, because he would have kind of preemptively made sure that you weren't suffering. So
right. I'm not sure we can ever say there is no suffering, because like if you imagine good and bad as like a scale or a gradient,
right.
And right now what we currently experience on the very end of bad, the very end, that's suffering. But let's say God took all that away, that's down there.
Yeah.
And then what we have left is like the very top of the spectrum, which is like good, like super good is at the top. Right. And then like it goes down and it's like, it's still good, but it's less good.
Right.
And if that's all we experience, that's our new gradient. And what is now less good is now our suffering.
Yeah.
It's hard to overcome that. But you definitely can say that there is needless suffering in the world, like the Holocaust. Like we keep talking about the Holocaust and like genocide and starvation. It's needless suffering.
Yeah, and that's not like on a continuum of like, well, okay, that in some universe, the Holocaust is somewhere in the middle, like that's god awful. Like everybody knows that. It's not like, hey, the whole world is ice cream and they don't have a flavor I like.
Exactly.
That's the spectrum that you're talking about. It's like, that's a continuum.
And like our suffering right now, like when the dishwasher breaks and we have to wash our dishes with running water in a sink with soap. Right. And we're like, oh, this sucks so bad. I wish I had a dishwasher. But then like our grandmothers back in the 1920s, they didn't have dishwashers.
Right. And there's some cultures where they're taking their stuff down to the river and washing it like on rocks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And they don't have soap and, all that kind of
stuff.
It's
like cholera and.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if a human invented God, of course, prayer would be required because you have to be able to communicate. And then God would never give you a clear answer. He would give you like real clever answers like yes, no, wait, or yes, no, maybe, which we already talked about in the milk jug episode.
Yeah.
There's no difference between that and just basic probabilities of getting the answer to your prayer.
Yeah. Or like a magic 8-ball will give you better answers than yes, no, wait. At least it's like try again later or.
It is decidedly so.
Yeah.
Right.
You get more answers, more range of answers at least.
Right.
Even if they're just as meaningless. But yeah, when there's no differentiation between God and a milk jug and a magic 8-ball, that's a problem.
Right. And if you can think of like, well, if I were God and I wanted to do prayer better, and you can think of a way that you can do prayer better, which we've already talked about, like it's actual two-way communication. Well, that tells you that there's something wrong, because if we can think of a way that prayer would be better than how it currently is, interacting with the supposedly real God, well, then that's not the best way.
And if a Christian was here right now hearing us, they would say, God can't talk to you back because then you would know too much.
Right.
And you would know about God, you would believe in God, and you wouldn't need faith.
Right.
But if God were real, you wouldn't need faith.
Right. Faith is only something you need if there's no evidence.
Yeah.
If you have evidence and proof, then that's correct. You don't need faith, which goes back to that thing we've said many times, that having faith is not a virtue. It's a flaw and it's a delusion. Yeah. It's not something that someone should be proud that they have.
It's something that you need to arrive at every religion.
Right.
You shouldn't think that it's a virtue when you can use faith to arrive at a faulty conclusion.
Yeah, you can use faith to arrive at any conclusion.
Yeah.
I can have faith right now that there's a flying spaghetti monster in my garage. But when I go out there and look at my garage, the only thing that's out there is a bunch of shit.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is that you could still insist it's there. It's just invisible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So moving on to another way that God might communicate, let's talk about the aspects of science and nature. So you would think that if God were real, that then science would be able to confirm his existence. And then nature would also be consistent kind of with the character of God, right? Like God would have made the world with humans in mind. Like nature wouldn't have all this danger. You wouldn't have natural disasters.
Yeah, you wouldn't need parasites and
malaria
and mosquitoes and all these kinds of creatures whose job it is just to create misery, not just in humans, but in other animals.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole process of evolution just itself was agonizing to all conscious creatures.
Right.
It's a system that is based on death.
Right.
It doesn't work without death. So it's a horrible way for an all-loving, all-powerful God to bring about living creatures.
Yeah, that puts a knock in the coffin of like theistic evolution, because you can't say, oh, well, God just kicked it off and then he allowed all these things to die because that's how it was going to work.
And when that gets brought up in that group that we're both in, where the Christians believe in evolution, their response is that, well, you don't know what God considers good. We don't know what's good. And I'm like, I know this is not good.
Right.
I could do it better. Okay, so one thing I could do better, predation is horrible. Yeah. We could all photosynthesize. Why not?
Yeah, why not?
We all have surface area.
Yeah.
Why couldn't every human, every animal, every plant, everything photosynthesize?
Why not?
I just made it better.
You just made it better. Yeah, and there wouldn't be like design flaws in our bodies. Like one of a friend of ours that posted about wisdom teeth this week. Did you see her post?
Yeah.
Saying that she had wisdom teeth like were below the gum line and they were growing like sideways or something like that. And then she goes, intelligent design, like you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have these things like vestigial organs.
The reason that Christians give for the wisdom teeth thing would be the fall. Everything got screwed up with the fall. But are they really saying that we did not have wisdom teeth before the fall? And then like as soon as Eve, ate the fruit, then God is like, oh, I'm going to give them an extra tooth at the back. That's really hard to clean. And it's going to be very problematic.
That's probably what they would say, because there was only two people back then and they didn't have wisdom teeth. And then Cain and Abel would have had wisdom teeth because they were the products of sin. So they probably would say that. And of course, unfalsifiable. So if there was no God, then our environment would be the result of unguided natural processes. That means that, there would be parts of the universe and the world that are uninhabitable.
Which is most of it.
Right. Which is what we see in reality now. Like food and safety wouldn't be guaranteed. There'd be war, genocide, famine, all these things that would, because shit just happens the way it happens. What does reality look like? The universe is huge. Most of the earth is freaking ocean.
Yeah. And inhospitable climates.
Yeah. The ocean terrifies me. Like I find it fascinating, but it's also like crazy if you really think about how much water is out there and like how deep it is and what kind of shit is under there. Like
one side of the earth is basically just water. Like if you look at a globe and you spin it, the one side is basically just blue.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm terrified of tornadoes. I think I've mentioned this before. I regularly have nightmares about tornadoes. And if there's a God, that really sucks.
Right.
That God created tornadoes or like allows tornadoes.
Right.
There's like towns that just get leveled in a span of a few minutes.
Yeah.
Horrible.
You get a lot of tornadoes in Maryland?
No. I mean, every now and then, but no, it's not something that we regularly worry about.
But God loves you so much, he gave you the fear of tornadoes, even though you've never been exposed to one.
Never been exposed to one, no.
But yeah, there's so many design flaws that you see, like humans having too many teeth to fit in their mouth.
Yeah.
75% of human embryos miscarry. So what are some of the ways, we kind of talked about some of these, but what are some of the ways that this could be done better? We talked about suffering a little bit, and that maybe there wouldn't be gratuitous suffering.
Yeah.
There might still be things that are bad, but it wouldn't be just like abject suffering that you can categorically say this is horrible, There
would be no murder and there would be no child abuse if I were God.
Right.
Okay, let's grant the Christian that human beings need free will, and that includes the free will to inflict harm on other people. That violates the free will of the victim to not have harm inflicted on them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So if you were God, how could this be prevented? Do you have any ideas? Because I do.
You're saying that there's a way that free will could exist in your...
I think so, yeah, because you can still have the desire to kill people, and you could go and try to do it.
Right.
But like, let's say that you were there as a person, as a human being, and somebody's trying to murder me. Would you, I mean, if you're really brave and you knew you weren't going to die,
right? You
would get in front of me and like Elsa did, right? She put her hand up and she stopped the knife from going in. Why couldn't God do that?
Yeah.
And that would save the victim. And all it's doing is preventing the knife from like connecting to the person and actually being murdered. And then, well, what would a human do? What would humans do? We would put that criminal in jail. God could be like, oh, sorry, you're a bad person. Boop, you're gone.
Right. Yeah.
Why not?
Right. Yeah, if you're gonna try to kill someone, then God gets to just
Yeah.
vaporize you from the
I
planet.
don't know if that's the right way to do it, but I know the wrong way to do it is to be so obsessed with free will that
Right.
you're like, criminals, sure, go ahead. Rape,
Right.
murder, steal, whatever you want to do.
Right.
I'm not going to intervene and I'm not going to protect the people who are being murdered and raped.
Right. I always find this interesting when people talk about free will. They're the same people that are saying, don't take my guns, but my kids are getting shot up in school, or don't let the drag queens have story hour because they're indoctrinating my kids. But I'm really into free will.
Yeah.
If you're doing something that is not genuinely loving or genuinely beneficial to society, there's a recipient of your free will that is having their free will violated.
Exactly.
What would this God be like? What characteristics would God have if he were real? Let's do not real first.
Okay. So if God were invented by a specific group at a specific time, you would expect that there would be similarities between that God and other fictional gods at the time, like of surrounding cultures.
Right.
So do we see that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at the whole Old Testament is like just borrowed mythology from other stuff of the time, the Sumerian mythology,
Yeah, Akkadian,
Baal, all those gods that were supposedly the false gods that the Israelites were not supposed to worship, and there was millions of them.
like Baal and El.
Right, like there was tons of them. Like the Amalekites had their god, and this
They weren't different from Yahweh. They were all the same.
No, they weren't any different. Like, yeah,
Yahweh requires blood sacrifice, right? Just like other gods at the time.
Right.
Which we look at it now and we're thinking like, okay, well, that's weird that God requires blood sacrifice. Why would he do that? Oh, it's because all the other gods did and it was the popular thing to do.
Right. And then you see that even carried through into the New Testament and how Christianity is today, that blood sacrifice is still required. That's why Jesus had to die, which is so archaic. Like, if you really think about it, like, why would a loving God require death and blood as a means to salvation? It doesn't even make sense. Like,
and we're talking about the God who invented like everything.
Right.
Including all the science that we now understand.
Right.
Quantum physics.
Right.
And more that we haven't understood yet.
Yeah.
And it cares about the shedding of blood. It cares about animal sacrifice. It thinks that there's a pleasing aroma of an animal sacrifice.
Yeah.
That doesn't line up.
If humans invented God, then of course the God would look like gods of other religions. And then like the stories surrounding the gods would all look similar too. Like the virgin birth story.
Yeah.
A god came down and impregnated a woman, and then there's a god offspring. That's common in all mythology.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be a virgin necessarily, but a mortal. So like a father god and a mortal woman. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that is a classical trope.
Yeah,
and then also
classic.
the Jesus like being a dying and rising figure. I've read a lot about, or I've watched a lot of like videos of Richard Carrier and everything. I'm not sure if these theories like are actually held by mainstream scholarship, but there were like other figures that possibly were dying and rising, like Osiris, Dionysius, and all those examples come from the ancient Near East.
Right. And there's some Chinese mythologies and Asian mythologies that are the same thing, where someone died and they came back from the dead. Egyptians had the same thing. That was a common thing, because what a great way to prove that your God was real is you were dead and then they came back. Christianity made up the same thing, and they said, oh, he was seen by these 2 witnesses and then the 500. And, these are all just like great stories that serve as some kind of proof. But the problem is that nobody was actually there to document the actual proof, because it was all hearsay,
So let's say that the Christian God is real. What are the odds that the one true God, he created the universe and he sat back and watched billions of years go by and then watched as humans started inventing gods, right? Like Baal and El and all the others. And then God was like, those are pretty good guesses. They have pretty good guesses down there in the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah.
Their gods are almost like me, the real God. Well, I guess I'll head down there now and make myself known to them. That won't be at all confusing.
Right. Or I won't head down. I'll send down some tablets and put them in some rock, and I'll have a guy with a big beard say, I ran into God. He was in a burning bush.
True. Although he did actually appear in the garden, and he did close the door of the ark, and then he wrestled with Jacob. So like he did come and do some stuff.
Yeah, but in all those stories, you don't ever see that the person saw God. Like when Moses saw God, it says he couldn't see him. Because he couldn't look directly at God. God passed by him and he was hid behind a rock. All the people that are in the ark, it doesn't ever say that God physically closed the door of the ark and anybody saw him. And in the Garden of Eden, it also says, that God walked in the garden and talked with Adam, but it doesn't really go into a lot of detail about how that looked. Did they see each other? I always think about that story that said like Adam and Eve were hiding from God in the garden. How the fuck were they hiding from God? From the omnipotent, omniscient God who created the damn garden and put him in there, and they're hiding. That doesn't make any sense. That's a sidebar.
It's like Truman trying to hide in the Truman Show.
Right. Yeah. It's like
pretty impossible when you have 1,000 cameras on you.
Yeah. And I guess, Christians would say that, oh, well, God took the form of a God that they would understand. But then that means that God didn't have enough forward thinking to see how ridiculous and dubious that would look once you zoom out and see the big picture.
Yeah. Like us looking back. Yeah.
Yeah. And if God can see the past and the future, he would know, oh, well, they're going to create me in the image that they understand. Like
that it would look confusing for us later.
Yeah, it would look super confusing. Why would he be the real
suspicious
one and the rest of them are not real? That doesn't even make sense. Like,
yeah, if he had all the wisdom in the world or all the wisdom in the universe, then God would know that this would be problematic for rational human beings at any point in time to look back and see that Yahweh was the same as all the others.
Yeah.
That there's nothing special about Yahweh. Wouldn't Yahweh actually want to be set apart?
Right.
And be markedly different from the rest of the fake gods?
Yeah, it seems like he would do something different that would make him stand out. And people would say, oh. And, you see these fictional stories where, like, supposedly God did stuff like that in the Old Testament. Like when the prophets of Baal were going to challenge Elijah and they were going to build an altar to the gods. And the prophets of Baal marched around this altar for I don't know how many days and nothing ever happened, and then Elijah went out and he prayed around his altar and then God sent down fire. If that really happened, well, shit, I would have believed in that God too. Like it was pretty obvious, the fire from heaven is a pretty good indicator, but
too bad that never happened.
Too bad it didn't happen. Like that's just.
And plus the people who wrote the book about God are the ones who believed in God. And so of course they're going to write something where that is supposed proof of God.
Right. Christians did kind of, take a shot at giving God like these divine characteristics that would transcend humanity, like you were saying. Like, well, that's what the omnis are, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent. They tried to make all those say, oh, our God is this thing. But then they didn't realize that for God to have all those qualities, they're logically inconsistent, which we've talked about. It seems like in every episode, like how those omnis, they can't all exist, so they tried to say you just created a fictional character. And then because you're not ever going to require any evidence, you can just say, well, God is all these things, but really it's not possible for a God to be all those things, in reality. To wrap up this topic, I think we can safely draw the conclusion that the current God of Christianity is exactly what we'd expect from a deity that was created by humans to exert power and control over people. And if we as humans are able to look at God and see numerous ways that he could be doing things better, then it makes it really hard to use logic and reason as your tools to verify that God is real. Specifically the Christian God, that's what we've been focusing on, but really any God.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's so easy to come up with better ways, even just one better way to do something.
Right.
It says a lot about the existence of this God that they're claiming exists.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that topic. We want to kind of end this segment with a parable, which is, in the Bible was a type of story that Jesus used to tell to get his point across. And I think this is I came across this again in the book that I'm reading. I thought it would be really useful for people listening because it talks about how hard it is to walk away from faith. It tells that story. So this is kind of a way to kind of wrap up this episode and be, I don't know, I guess feel this like a kind of encouragement in where you are in your journey. Once you commit to live your life as a person of faith, once you start the journey, faith becomes a part of you that is hard to jettison. We may think of the faith journey like climbing the world's highest peak and looking for anything that will help along the way, as illustrated in the following parable. Frank is about to climb Mount Everest, and he knows he is risking his life to do so. On the way to base camp, he stops to pray at a remote temple where he meets a monk. With an air of mysticism, the monk convincingly predicts that Frank will make it to the summit and descend safely, but warns, there is one thing you must do. You must wear this magic coat that I'm giving you. There's no other coat like it in the world. This coat will not only keep you warm, it will empower you to make it to the top. It will give you courage, endurance, protection. Only with this coat will you succeed. Without it, you will surely die on the mountain. Frank is mesmerized by the words of the monk. He leaves a generous offering and dons the one-of-a-kind magic coat, a coat that looks like any other but has hidden powers. Soon, Frank is trudging upward with other climbers, one of whom is wearing a coat just like his. The climber asks Frank where he got that coat, and upon learning it was from the monk, laughs and asks, "How much did you give him for your magic coat?" The laughing climber explains that the man is not a monk, but a shrewd salesman who has learned that he gets paid the most for a coat when he boasts of its powers, gives it away, and asks for nothing in return. He tells Frank that a number of the climbers who donned the monk's imposter magic coats have frozen to death on the mountain. Successfully climbing the world's highest peak is not about wearing a magic garment. It's about conditioning, timing, good decisions, endurance, and luck. But you do need protection from the cold. As much as Frank wants to take off the coat and fling it into the nearest crevasse, he has no other coat to wear. No matter how much the coat reminds him of his gullibility, he needs it to survive the chill of the wind. He doesn't need the coat to be magic. He needs it to keep him warm. Without the coat, he will die. He doesn't stop wearing the coat because it is all he has. That story kind of just tells why people wear their faith. Your faith, it was the way you dealt with all the challenges in your life. And shedding that coat can be a matter of survival. The reason we do this podcast, I think, is to really help people shed that coat. And it can be hard.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes you think about the stuff you believed. I know I do. And I'm like, man, what a dumbass. Like, how on earth did I believe this stuff? And then this story makes it perfect. Like, man, I needed to stay warm. I had to survive the mountain.
The coat isn't a coat. It's a cancer. It's a tumor.
Yeah.
You need it as much as you need a tumor.
Right.
You only think that you need it. You only think it's doing you good.
Yeah.
But it's a placebo effect. And you are getting through your problems on your own.
That's how we want to end today's episode. We thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Flawed Theology Podcast. I'm Phil.
And I'm Susie. Tune in next time where we will continue to tackle the question, if your theology were wrong, wouldn't you want to know?
Make sure you join us on our Facebook group, which is called Dangerous Questions. It's a place that we hope to connect with people, just to be a safe space as you're on your journey away from faith, because like many of us have experienced, it can be scary. So join us on the Facebook group, Dangerous Questions. Follow us at theflawedtheologypodcast.com and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
And Christians say, oh, the Bible, I love it when people say that. Well, the Bible is so clear on this. Then you point out to them all the ways that it's not clear, and then they just throw one of the thought-terminating cliches at you, saying, oh, well, you don't understand it because you don't have the Holy Spirit, or, you know, his ways are higher than our ways. But I'm like, but I thought you said it was clear.
I once sat in the middle of my mom and my sister. They were literally on both sides of me. This was when my sister was converting to Seventh-day Adventism. And my sister was saying that, oh, you shouldn't drink because of XYZ in the Bible. It was like new wine. They thought it was translated as new wine, which is grape juice, and that you shouldn't drink actual wine. And then my mom had verses to back her up. And I was just sitting there thinking, how could both of them have verses that justify their positions from the same book that's supposed to be from God? Like, it shouldn't be this confusing. And that was like 12, 15 years ago. Yeah. So I'm thinking that really took a chink out of the armor for me. Started letting a lot of doubt to build up.